Hi everybody, it's Scott from Passport Attitude coming to you from the gazebo on my back deck, a little pandemic oasis that we've created and used a lot these last several weeks. I hope you and your family are hanging in there during this unbelievably challenging time. It's important to remember, though, that during all of this craziness, there are still a lot of wonderful things that are going on. There are countless acts of kindness and charity, people rising to meet this occasion with courage and with concern for their fellow humans. And those stories don't get as much attention in the press as they probably should, but they are happening and they're worth celebrating. But as we all know, this pandemic is not only threatening our collective health and our economy, it's also more deeply exposing the fractures that already exist within our community life. This seems like a time when people would put aside some of their usual differences and rally together for the common good, since this pandemic respects no political or religious boundaries. But sadly, this has not always been the case. And to add to much of this division, an even more enduring plague continues to raise its ugly head in our society, and that is the scourge of racism. While strides have been made in this department, there is still an alarming level of racism among segments of our population. And today, as I sit here at home, there continue to be protests taking place around our country over the death of George Floyd, an African American man whom Minneapolis police apprehended and killed, basically. He died in police custody after officers subdued him, and one in particular held him face down on the pavement with his knee on George's neck for 8 or 9 minutes straight while he pleaded that he couldn't breathe. On the very day that I was celebrating 50 years of life, he was having the life squeezed right out of him. An absolutely horrifying and heartbreaking event. And this wanton cruelty shown by these officers was captured on video by a few bystanders, and it justifiably outraged not only Minneapolis, where accusations of police racism have been a consistent issue for the city, but all across the nation. Most people of all ethnicities know that the vast majority of police officers are just trying to do their job well and honestly desire to serve and protect the community in ways that are fair. But there are enough bad apples out there, and at some police departments in particular, where this horrible racist thinking continues to rear its ugly head. And this brings to my mind the very important question of how this kind of racist thinking and behavior takes hold and becomes deep-seated in certain people. How does racism become ingrained in certain people and communities? And why has it persisted even to this present day? And this brings me to one important lesson that can be learned at a public square in the center of Berlin, Germany, a place known today as Bebelplatz. It is pretty well known that the atrocities committed by Hitler and the racist Nazis in the 1930s and 40s were horrific and reprehensible, leaving a charred and decimated landscape that saw millions killed, where those who resisted were imprisoned, and where those who survived were often psychologically scarred for life. Instead of leaving the world a better place than they found it, the Nazis left primarily a legacy of hatred, harm, and blind allegiance to an ignorant and misinformed madman. What a shame. One of the many factors that led to their pathetic legacy was the fact that they went to great lengths to control the kind of information that people received. They severely restricted or eliminated any contrary viewpoints that would cast doubt on their goals and their plans, and they constantly reinforced their stupid racist ideology through the persistent propaganda of people like Joseph Goebbels. And nowhere was this attempt at thought control more visibly seen than in the infamous Nazi book burnings that started in 1933 in several German university towns and cities. Perhaps the most famous of these book burnings took place in Berlin at Bebelplatz. On May 10, 1933, at least 20,000 volumes that were deemed un-German were tossed into a bonfire, with propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels firing up the ignorant ranks, and thus began a massive undertaking of censorship and cultural control that later led to a much more serious and consequential destruction, the fiery elimination of millions of human lives in the Holocaust. What a devastatingly sad chapter in human history. And While book burning doesn't seem to happen as much today, sadly, the mentality behind it still very much persists in some circles. It can be seen in a great variety of organizations and groups. One of the ways that these groups try to maintain control over people is by limiting what information is available to them, by banning any thoughts, books, media, or suggestions that there's another way to look at the situation. They often encourage their group members to get their information from only one source, or only from approved sources. They discourage cross-referencing and fact-checking out of fear that other contrary viewpoints will wiggle their way in. They're very much against people having a passport attitude of crossing any non-approved borders. They don't want people to think for themselves because that might introduce doubt and loosen the grip on power that they have. They may not receive wholehearted allegiance or the donations that they so desperately need to keep their group going. They depend very heavily on their view not being challenged or questioned. The deep irony of book burning and of censorship and thought control is that people who perpetrate such flame-throwing ideologies, like racism for instance, they try to look tough and powerful by acting in these ways and showing the dominance and confidence of their worldview. But in reality, they're only showing how weak their views really are. If your ideology can't stand up to scrutiny and skepticism, if it can't take a punch or handle a contrary viewpoint, if it doesn't like evidence that would challenge it or force it to rethink, then that ideology is pretty pathetic. Using tactics like book burning, censorship, and the limiting of outside viewpoints are a dead giveaway that your ideology is weak and lacking in confidence. Groups and individuals who use these tactics are just producing smoke screens to mask the fact that they don't have evidence and reason on their side. And if I'm being honest, I can certainly recognize times in my own life when I've used these book burning, censoring tactics to keep contrary ideas at bay. I didn't want to go through the difficult and uncomfortable work of changing my mind. It's much easier to think what you've always thought and to only listen to voices who will reinforce that belief. And I'm not alone in this. Most of us struggle with confirmation bias, that tendency to cherry pick information that only confirms our existing beliefs or ideas. You see, constantly evaluating our worldview, that's exhausting. So we prefer to strengthen it instead, and this means that we often ignore contrary evidence and focus only on those sources of information that back up and reinforce our current views. It simplifies things. But it also means that oftentimes we are simply just wrong, that we're believing things that don't have the weight of evidence and reason. And believing in wrong things can lead to some very serious consequences that affect not only you, but others as well. Case in point, this recent death of George Floyd. If you believe that people of other races aren't your equal and that you can completely disregard their rights and their safety, and if you marinate in a culture that reinforces that belief, or at least doesn't challenge it, then eventually you can get to the point where you think it's acceptable to kneel on a man's neck until he's unresponsive, even though he was never a threat to you in the first place. See, believing in wrong things matters. And the only way that any of us can escape the traps of our own wrong thinking is to have those beliefs challenged from time to time, and for us to genuinely look at that contrary evidence, knowing full well how easily we can fool ourselves. You see, our goal should not be to constantly reinforce our own existing beliefs, even though it's good for us all to have things that we believe in. We need to engage in a consistent fight against our confirmation bias so that we can arrive at a better and fuller understanding of how our world works and what is more likely to be true and what is more likely to lead to a better world for as many of us as possible. And that goal can really only be accomplished if we allow contrary evidence and other viewpoints to challenge our existing worldview from time to time. It's about developing a passport attitude, asking hard questions, crossing new borders, being uncomfortable once in a while, all for the sake of better understanding yourself as well as the world around you. Now, this may mean that once in a while, as you allow some of your cherished views to be challenged, you may find that you change your mind as new evidence comes to light. This could be a small shift in thinking, or perhaps even a life-altering change in how you view the world. It can be very hard and even heart-wrenching to to admit that you've been wrong about a certain viewpoint or worldview. None of us, including myself, like admitting that we were wrong. But really, this is not a sign of weakness or defeat. If you change your mind about something because the evidence was more compelling, even if that change of mind is difficult or embarrassing to admit, you're exhibiting signs of strength and maturity in making that change. You are aligning yourself more closely with what is most likely to be true. And that is a much better place to be than in a comfortably ignorant place that only seeks reinforcement. The Nazi book burning mentality that was on display in the 1930s and the current groups of white supremacists that persist today are really sad reminders of what it means to be comfortably ignorant. That's one reason why I lit up with a huge smile when our Eastern Europe Walking Adventures group was in Berlin in 2016 and we visited Bebelplatz on our walk. Instead of charred books and academic ashes, there was instead a public outdoor reading library with colorful beanbags set up and families reading together. And this was such a stark contrast to the fearful, flame-throwing bibliophobes of the dastardly Nazi regime. See, there is a huge difference between an open and truth-seeking attitude and a totalitarian one that is closed off to any outside, non-approved viewpoints. What we saw at Bebelplatz was a beautiful and colorful case of taking a wrong and making it right. Using your passport sometimes allows you to see a society learn from its mistakes and chart a new and healthier path. And we could use a lot more of that attitude right about now, couldn't we? Whether we're addressing racism, politics, religion, or a whole host of other issues. We need more people who aren't afraid to have their viewpoint challenged and who will genuinely interact and try to learn from those who see it differently. This isn't to say that all viewpoints are equally valid, far from it. Truth and evidence matter when it comes to forming our views. But in order to help ourselves overcome our own built-in confirmation bias, we have to be willing to look at our views from time to time as an outsider would, as someone who doesn't cherish our viewpoint. And that means consistently engaging with those who would challenge our views, and doing so with an open mind as opposed to a closed one. And frankly, it's pretty uncomfortable to do this, and I don't recommend doing it all the time because that can be a bit too stressful. But it's so necessary that we build this kind of thinking into our lives at least occasionally. So let me ask you, when was the last time you genuinely took a look at a viewpoint that directly contradicts one of your own? Might I suggest that you do just that in the coming week or two? I'll try to do the same. It can be on any topic or viewpoint that you'd like, but what's keeping you from crossing that psychological border and looking back at your viewpoint from the other side? When you cross that border and look at another point of view, don't make that journey in order to just prove the other side wrong, but really try to dig down and understand why the other side regards your viewpoint with skepticism. Again, this is pretty uncomfortable, but it'll help you better understand the reasons that some people don't share your view and perhaps put a more human face on those that you disagree with. Whether you're having a conversation with someone from a different point of view, or perhaps reading a book or article that is in conflict with your own thinking, you may surprisingly find many points in common and areas on which you can both agree. You may find that there is a lot less black and white on a particular issue and quite a bit of nuance and gray area in particular topics. You may find that the evidence against your viewpoint is pretty weak, but that many of the people who hold the opposite view are really genuine and good people who perhaps have just been misinformed, or maybe they're just having a hard time shedding their view because of the social costs of going against family and friends. You may also find that the evidence against your viewpoint is really strong and that your position is weaker than you once thought it was. And that's a pretty tough place to find yourself, but it can also be a moment of growth for you and offer you a chance to revise and improve your thinking in a particular area. Now more than ever, our world needs people who will abandon a book-burning mentality in favor of a lifestyle that seeks to be well-informed and unafraid of contrary viewpoints. It's the best way for us to grow and to move forward and to defeat the lingering and malicious effects of things like racism. So, do your best to fact-check your online information sources. Don't rely on social media as your primary news source because social media algorithms are designed to present the news that only reinforces your current views, not a balanced view. There are some helpful fact-checking sites out there that include factcheck.org, PolitiFact, Snopes.com, Washington Post Fact Checker, and Media Bias Fact Check, just to name a few. And these and other sites like them can help you more independently verify if you're getting your info from sources that are known for high-quality investigative reporting, or whether you might be dealing with an organization that has a tendency to promote propaganda, pseudoscience, or conspiracy theories and the like. So, look for articles that include more in-depth coverage that can capture some of the complexity of topics and events. And if a news article or source elicits a very emotional reaction from you, it might be good to take a deep breath first and investigate further. The primary goal of fake news producers is often to create a very emotional, visceral reaction among readers so that it will be spread virally. So I would encourage you not to fall for their tricks. Finally, I just want to say how grateful I am that I have people in my life who see the world a bit differently than me. Like the colorful beanbags I witnessed at Bebelplatz, our different stories and viewpoints are what make life more vibrant and interesting. For those of you in my life who have disagreed with me on a particular issue, you might be watching right now, please know that I deeply value you. I really do. I've learned wonderful lessons from you, and I continue to hold you in high regard, even though we may not see eye to eye on some important matters. Many of you have shown me what true kindness and genuine love really is. You've shown me how to work hard, how to impact a community. You have exhibited grace under pressure, a sense of humor, an eager desire to learn new things, and so much more. And I believe our friendship and our respect for one another doesn't hinge on whether we line up 100% politically, religiously, or otherwise. When the book-burning mentality is applied to people, as it often has been in recent times, there are catastrophic and tragic results. When someone disagrees with your political or religious position, and you write them off completely with a dehumanizing and bullying tone, when you angrily spew vitriol at them and fire Facebook missiles from the safety of your man cave or your she shed, the world is worse off as a result, and you have lost out on an opportunity to learn and to find common ground and to show the next generation how civilized, mature people behave. So, what do you say we reject a book-burning mentality and deny leadership to anyone that embraces it? We can do better than this. All my best to each of you. I hope you have a wonderful summer.